Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today, we're back with Amos Zweig for a new video conversation and a new topic. We figured out that today we were going to discuss animal rights and the whole issue and controversy surrounding that. How should we understand animals with regards to morality, moral rights, and differences between human beings and animals in that regard? We may discuss, or we are going to discuss issues that is relevant to veganism and related issues. So, Amos, first of all, thank you for coming on to talk about this. I suppose we could start off by perhaps defining the perhaps first present the position of the vegans who believe that animals have rights that we must respect that are not respected today, and contrast that with the conventional view or practice in society today. What do you think about that sort of start of this conversation?
Yes, I think I would first start by quickly defining rights, which is something we have talked a lot about in our last conversation, and then move on with this idea that you have presented. So with the position of vegans or of people who feel that animals have rights.
Great, okay.
So I think in our last conversation, we have sort of, we have touched upon a couple of points about what a right actually is. And one thing that we found is that rights in their origin come from human nature, and also that they have kind of two purposes, it seems. One purpose is to act like a moral shield, that a person can do certain things without risking to be or feel like a bad person or a bad human being. So in that sense, rights kind of define an area of action that a human being can freely choose to operate in without being immoral. And also in society, rights have this function of organizing or limiting behavior of each individual or of each member of society, so that other people can then act based on their rights. So if I have a right to do X, then you do not have the right to hinder me from doing X.
Right, yes, I remember we discussed this extensively in the last conversation, which was very interesting. And if any of you in the audience have not watched that conversation, we recommend taking a look at it, because it's very interesting and thoughtful, or thought-provoking, you might say. Great, so as you pointed out, this idea of rights is connected to human nature and our journey toward becoming good human beings, and the rights working as a moral shield to protect us in that journey. So we have a right to own private property, because that is a good thing for us to establish a family, to flourish as human beings, etc. We have the right to build a shelter for survival. We have the right to establish friendships, good friendships, which can help us become more virtuous, and other things. But when it comes to animals, we see that they are not in the same position as human beings, because they do not have this moral responsibility that human beings have. They don't have this condition in which they choose between good and evil, and have this journey toward becoming morally virtuous. We see rather that animals, they have a nature just as we have a nature, but the nature determines their behavior. They have instincts. They act according to instincts and according to this environment that they're in, instead of having this volition that human beings have. However, still, I think many defenders of the idea of animal rights, vegans, I think they would agree with this, but still they believe that animals have rights because they are, it seems many argue, they are sentient beings. They have the ability to feel and to feel pain, for instance, and therefore they would have rights to certain things and rights to avoid certain things similar to human beings, at least to some extent. I think most animal activists would agree that animals do not share absolutely all the same rights as human beings, but at least some of those rights. So yeah, I suppose the controversy would be surrounded around this idea. So what do you think?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think you captured one of the main arguments well, that people who how do you say, argue for animal rights, they often say exactly that animals also have they also experience pain. They are sentient beings, and therefore they would prefer not to feel pain. And thus, kind of by an argument from analogy, since human beings also prefer not to feel pain, and many of the rights that we have defined in our society have exactly that purpose, to hinder one person from inflicting pain on another person. And therefore, you could say that these rights should also be extended to animals, because they can also suffer, and so it's kind of analogous. Now, I think that that's actually a false argument. And I think that even, and I do agree that there shouldn't be unnecessary suffering in the world, and I include animals in that. I think still this is a human conception, this idea that there shouldn't be unnecessary suffering is a human conception, and also rights are a human conception. So as we said, or as you said previously, animals have a nature, and their nature determines their behavior. They don't have a free will. They can't make moral choices. And also, if you look at the organization of how certain animals live together, like, for example, dogs, or I don't know, penguins or dolphins or fish, they have kind of certain rules which they seem to follow, but it's more just happening out of them acting the way they do by their instincts. It's not like they have some conscious agreement with each other about certain ways in which they will interact, or certain actions that they will not do. For example, one wolf will not just attack another wolf of its pack and try to kill it, but they don't have a moral rule. It's just the way they behave. And so these are a couple of arguments that I would make why I think this analogy doesn't work, even though I see where it comes from.
Right. Yes, many good points you brought up there. Exactly. So we see that human beings, because we have free will, we have responsibility over what we choose to do. We have reason, so we can distinguish between good and evil. We can therefore realize moral goods or virtues, such as prudence and love and justice, etc., which are moral goods. They are goods which we can freely choose to promote and to exercise. In a sense, we can exercise or appropriate virtues. But since animals act according to instinct, they cannot acquire moral goods. Then they can acquire material goods, in a sense that they can feed themselves with food, etc., but not moral goods. And moral rights, the purpose of moral rights is to protect an agent in his realization of moral goods. That is why it is moral rights, because it's connected to that. But since animals lack this nature that makes them able to have this freely chosen moral goods and obtain that, we therefore miss the foundation of them having moral rights as human beings have. And that seems to me to be the main argument I would present against the vegan position, against the position that animals have these rights similar to human beings. So I will also point out that people like Peter Singer, a defender of this idea that animals have rights not to be eaten or not to be killed, at least that's how I understand his position. He argues that to believe that there's a difference between human beings and animals is a form of speciesism. The idea that we have this arbitrary preference toward human beings against animals, that is merely a bias, since perhaps we are human beings who are biased toward humanity and against other animals, according to people like Peter Singer. So that's just an irrational bias and not an irrational argument. But that is not the case at all, because we just presented a very logical argument based on the nature of human beings compared to the nature of animals and the nature and purpose of moral rights. So it's philosophical consideration about reality, because things and people have natures inherent in them. It's not an arbitrary preference, it's a recognition of how objective reality works. So that's a response I would give to the objection of speciesism.
Yes, also interesting points. I would like to go into this idea of speciesism just a little bit later, because I have some answers to your previous points. First, I see from our last conversation, and I think it's a good objection that you brought up there, that rights actually have to do with the moral quest of a human being. So you need rights so that you can act and develop yourself in the world, and at the same time be a virtuous or good human being. Because rights define, as we said, this kind of shield or this kind of area inside which you can then act. So I think that's one important objection. And the other important objection in my mind is this aspect of organizing society. So rights, I think, are a way in which human beings organize their social life, because human beings live in groups, and so they consciously talk about and decide about the rules by which they will want to live in this group. And animals cannot consciously make agreements, and you can also not consciously make an agreement with an animal. So the example I always give is, I cannot make a contract with the mouse that lives in my basement that I will give it a small piece of cheese every day, but it should leave the rest of my food in my basement alone. The mouse will just eat whatever it finds attractive. And of course, you can make many more similar examples. So the point I'm trying to make is that rights always have two sides. It's always a form of agreement between two human beings, or between more than two, between a whole group. And if the counterparty doesn't act according to the agreement, then there is no agreement, and then there is not something like a right. Then there is just basically physical force or physical interaction, but you can't then really talk of a right.
Those are very interesting points you brought up there, Amos, that we see that rights, according to what you said, there is something societal or social about it, and societal and social things imply that there is some agreement or understanding between human beings, because we have the ability to make social agreements and recognize things like, say, rights between human beings. Now, I imagine that some critics would object and say that, well, this is not true of all human beings. For instance, you have very small children, infants, who also have rights, the right to life and other rights, but they are not able to make such an agreement. Now, I have an answer to that objection, but perhaps you want to respond yourself first to that objection.
Yes, good objection that you brought up there, kind of trying to think in the way of how some critics could think. Now, I think we would probably see similar on this question, that even though children cannot yet at the moment understand conscious agreements and respect them or act in that manner like grown-up adults, still they are of the same type. So they are also human beings, and they have the potential and will over time develop this capacity. And it's also, of course, interesting to note in this scenario that we do not treat small children the same way that we treat adults. So, for example, sometimes the parents will decide what a small child has to do or is not allowed to do, or take certain objects away from it, or say, now you have to eat this, or you have to go to bed, or you have to do this, or you have to wear these clothes because that's a social convention. And so in a sense, many of these rights that we have decided in a society, we don't in the same way give to small children.
Yes, there are differences between the rights we have given to adults and children, as you pointed out. And also that could be true for mentally handicapped people who are under the jurisdiction of some supervisor and therefore are limited in their freedoms, you could say, compared to adults. And that is also perfectly in line with the principle I was talking about earlier, that rights are connected to the realization of moral goods and what is necessary for that realization. And children, of course, need parents to guide them and take care of them and prevent them from doing harmful things because they are vulnerable and they're not fully developed adults yet. So therefore, it's very legitimate for parents to exercise authority and limit freedom. And it's also connected to human nature, basically. And I would also say, when it comes to the objection about infants, that, yeah, you sort of touched upon it yourself as well, that yes, infants lack this ability consciously and explicitly, but they have the inherent potential within the nature. Infants are human beings just as us, and the inherent ability to have a consciousness and make conscious agreements, it's not actualized in them, but it exists in them potentially. So you could say that they are still a subject of society in a sense, even though that is not fully developed in them yet. They still have it in their nature, and given time and them being raised by parents, etc., that potential will be actualized or realized over time. And then they will be able fully and explicitly to make such conscious agreements. And also one could take this thought further and say that you are sort of, when you are taking care of infants and respecting their rights, you are respecting also the rights of that infant becoming a human being later, of course the infant is a human being, but becoming an adult human being later. And therefore you can have in mind, when that infant becomes an adult and the rights he will have then, that the rights he will have then is connected to the rights he has now as an infant. So there is this interesting idea about time and potential versus actual, etc. So yes, those are some of the considerations that we could point out against this objection.
Yes, I did think, however, now that I was thinking about it, perhaps here is a little bit the point where this speciesism, or however you pronounce this, where this speciesism criticism attacks, because I could say, okay, a child perhaps has a different nature than an adult. They are both human beings, but they have different attributes, and so they will have different rights. And for example, I will take away access to dangerous objects from my child. I will just lock the door, for example, but I will not kill the child if it tries to access the dangerous goods. And so you could argue that the same would be the correct behavior in regard to this mouse in my basement, that I should just hinder this mouse from accessing my food, but I shouldn't kill it because it tries to eat my food. Because the mouse is like, it also has a nature which includes being alive, but it doesn't have consciousness, and so it cannot understand agreements. So what do you think to this possible objection here?
My response would be going back to the principle that infants have the potential to realize moral goods, but mouses do not. Because infants, because they are human beings, even though they are limited in their capacities because they're infants, they still have the potential to realize moral goods, which they will be able to do when they grow older. But with mouses, that is utterly impossible, because it is impossible according to the nature to become morally responsible agents. So therefore, it is not possible to talk about rights in that sense when it comes to mouses. With infants, however, you could say that, okay, the infants have rights that will protect them, so that the infant will, at a later period in time, be able to realize those moral goods, and the purpose of those rights is to make sure that those moral goods will occur in the future. But with mouses, there are no potential moral goods to speak of, because they will never be able to realize those goods, even in principle, because of their nature. So there is no moral goods, either now or in the future, for rights to protect in the case of mouses, contrary to infants. So that is what I would respond with.
Yes, I understand your point. I think it goes to that which you have said before, that kind of there is this time aspect that the child has, or we give to the child, or we talk about rights of children or infants, because they are on the path to becoming a fully grown adult, and the human nature, which is the basis or origin of rights, is the human nature, or the characteristics of a fully grown adult human being. And so from that kind of backwards comes certain important rights then in the end, that we have to even treat the child in a certain way, so that it can then, as an adult, function according to its human nature and act what his rights as an adult would be. Because, for example, if I amputate one hand of my child at birth, then this child then, as an adult, will no longer be able to act in the same prescribed region of human action that a moral right would give to all human beings.
Sorry, could you repeat the last point you made there, because I'm not sure if I fully got it.
Yes, so let's say we have, for example, a person has a right to change their own property according to their liking. So I can till my field, or I can cut my fruit trees, or I can do crafts craft work or things like that. But this right that we say human beings have when they are adults has certain requirements, which is that you have a fully functional human body. If you don't have hands, then you cannot do crafts work. And so the right, for example, that we say small children should have their bodily integrity respected in this example comes from the human nature of a grown human being, of an adult. And it kind of, as you said, we have to respect this right now, because in the future, this individual will become an adult and then have these rights. So I'm not sure if I'm making it clearer, but yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I understood your point that for a fully adult human being to be able to exercise certain things that is proper to his nature, he needs a bodily integrity, for instance, and that requires that his bodily integrity is respected when he was an infant and a child in general, in order to be able to exercise those things. Now, one could sort of point out that, sure, but some of the things that you exercise with your body are not virtues as such. For instance, working at the farm or doing crafts work is not inherently something virtuous. It becomes virtuous if you do it with a moral intention, you could say, but the act itself is morally neutral. So what would you say to that sort of objection?
I would say that as we have said, rights define a certain sphere of action inside which a human being can freely act if he wants to. And it's, for example, pointless to say that a human being has the right to fly because they don't have wings. Or it's pointless to say that you have the right to, I don't know, eat stone because you cannot eat stone. And so these rights that humans in society have come to agree upon that each person has, they only make sense if you have the capacity to then act on those rights. And therefore, you have to, in this example, maintain the bodily integrity of a human being through his growing up period, so that he can then exercise these rights when he is an adult.
Right, and those rights are, for instance, the right to do crafts work, or the right to farm, or things like that, if I understand.
Yes, or the right to manipulate your property.
Right, cultivate nature in order to build things, for instance.
For instance, yes.
Right, yes. Yeah, of course. Yeah, that's true. And also one could then discuss, okay, well, why does one have the moral right to cultivate nature and build houses, etc.? Well, in order to flourish as a human being and live in a prosperous environment that will make you sustain yourself and enhance society around you, etc. So yes.
Yes, and that would come from your human nature, speaking of an adult human being, of its nature.
Right, because then you exercise those virtues and moral goods, and
yes, and you have the capacity for moral choice as you are an adult.
Right. Yes. Now, of course, we could also include children at a certain age and teenagers also making moral choices. So one could talk about the sort of the age of reason, which some place at the age of 7, perhaps some place at 6. So there is a little discussion about, okay, when during the childhood do you become moral, but the point still stands, the principle still stands, as you pointed out. Yes, I was thinking of saying something else, but now I just forgot it. So perhaps you want to share some thoughts before I.
Yes, I'm still a little bit also thinking about this question of speciesism, or so. Yes, so we said that the reason that we ascribe certain rights to children, even though they are not yet capable of making moral choices or making conscious agreements and following rules consciously is because they are like potential adults, potential human beings, and therefore we need to maintain the characteristics that they need so that they can exercise these rights when they are adults. But I'm still thinking, I think some of the animal right people, they would find our argument a little bit, they wouldn't find it convincing. They would still say, yes, but a mouse can also live. And it's also in the nature of the mouse to live and perhaps to have children. And so if you kill the mouse, for example, then you destroy this faculty, which is also a part of its nature. And so I think we would have to talk about the fact that animals or different living beings kill other living beings in nature. And should we say this is just a part of their nature, that they kill other living beings? Or should we say that it's actually a moral problem?
Interesting. Well, first, just a quick clarification, since you said that children are potentially human beings. Just to clarify, they're actually human beings, but they are potentially adults, and which I'm sure your point was.
Yes, I agree.
Yes, right. So, yeah, to that, I would sort of go back to the same principle that the unique thing about human beings as such is the potential to exercise and promote moral goods like virtues, because they have free will, volition, and the intellect, the capacity to distinguish good from evil. And I could also formulate it in the way that the humanity or the human nature of every human being becomes valuable and morally significant by virtue of its inherent potential to promote moral goods. So the human nature itself becomes valuable by reason of that. And that means that everyone who shares in that human nature therefore become valuable, and they have moral rights because they participate in that human nature, which is valuable because of the potential to promote virtue. So that distinguishes therefore all human beings from other animals. Like mouses, they cannot, as we said, they act according to instinct, not according to volition and abstract comprehension. So we therefore don't see the achievement of moral goods and virtues, and therefore we don't see the moral rights being relevant as it is with human beings. So we see a difference in that regard. So that will sort of be my answer to this question generally. So yes, speciesism that Peter Singer and others talk about, it's false, because this argument about moral rights being grounded in the ability to create moral goods, those are philosophical considerations based on logical reasoning. It's not simply an arbitrary preference. It's not like we say only human beings have rights because we like human beings, they're so cool and fantastic. That would, you could say, be an arbitrary bias, but here we have a clear logical framework for our arguments. So that is so speciesism doesn't work as a working objection. So yes.
Yes, I think you summarized that or brought that well to a point, that speciesism doesn't work as an argument because there are fundamental differences in the nature of human beings compared to the nature of other living beings. And therefore, this idea doesn't work, because arbitrary bias is only, or a differentiation is only arbitrary as long as there is no objective ground for that differentiation. So I think that's a very good point. And I think it reminds me of something I thought in the beginning of our conversation, that so we observe in nature that some animals kill other animals. So for example, the cat kills mice, and it does that quite brutally. So the cat is not concerned with minimizing the suffering of the mouse, because it keeps playing with it and tortures it for a long time before it kills it. And some other animals, for example, chimpanzees, if they capture a small animal, they will just eat it while it's still alive. They don't care to first kill it and then eat it so that the other animal will suffer less. And there are many other examples of this. And so what my thought was that the idea that you should minimize suffering is actually, it has something to do not with the world outside of the acting person, but with the world inside. So this moral rule that you should, even if you kill an animal so that you can eat it, or you keep an animal in a pen so that you can milk it or take its eggs to eat, because you have the natural, it's in your nature that you need to do things in order to get food, still you should do it with, and try to cause only minimal suffering to this other being. This moral rule doesn't come from the other being, but it comes from human beings, because it will be beneficial to your personal development as a spiritual being, let's say, that you will care to not produce extra suffering in the world around you. Because if you just become a very cruel and sadistic person, then this will be something bad for your own moral development. So the origin of this idea that you shouldn't make animals suffer unnecessarily comes from this requirement of moral development of the human being itself, and not from the animal.
That was a very, very interesting and good point that you made there. And I have sort of thought sort of the same thing myself, because this touched upon the question of, okay, well, what makes it bad to impose pain on animals if they don't have these moral rights that we have been talking about? And it seems to me that we can say that we lack the right to impose unnecessary pain, because that would be contrary to our human nature and our moral development. So it's not so much about the animals in themselves, but rather we being limited in what we ought to do and ought not to do, as you pointed out. So that was a brilliant point that you made there. And it makes sense, because to be a sadistic person who enjoys pain, I can't think of anyone who would think of that as a virtuous person who really acts according to his nature and morality. So yes, that makes a lot of sense, I would say. And you can also talk about perhaps animals, at least animals that you own, like pets. They are such that you will enjoy having them. Many people who own pets, they usually have affection for their pets, and the pets can be a very enjoyable part of their life. So you could say that the animals become good for human beings, in a sense that they bring them affection and company, etc. And perhaps you could argue based on that therefore it is bad to abuse pets, because now they become this valuable good in relation to human beings, and therefore yes, to inflict pain on them would contradict their value for human beings, if you sort of see what I mean.
Yes, I think that's a good kind of like aspect of this argument that you brought up here. So because having pets can help a person become a more affectionate or caring or loving person, because you now have this living human being for which you care and which you love, and therefore it helps to promote this virtue in the person who owns the pet. And at the same time, if you have a pet and you torture it, then it helps you develop cruelty and, for example, what's this, like perhaps you hate this thing because otherwise why should you inflict pain on it? Or so it develops bad traits in you. And so again, the reason why you should treat your animals or your pets well is because of the effect that it has on you and on your moral development.
Right. So if you have a very bad person who is inflicting unnecessary pain on a pet he owns, he would therefore destroy a good that, or something that could be a good to him, because he could potentially love the pet and have affection for the pet, and the pet loving him back, and therefore you have this company, and that would be good for his life. It could improve his life quality. There are certain persons in the world who struggle with loneliness who might find pets to be very helpful in dealing with that. So when you do the opposite by being cruel toward the animal, which is obviously a very bad thing, you are therefore destroying something that could be good to you, and also potentially good to others, because in the future that pet might be transferred to someone else owned by others. Perhaps the animal runs away and finds someone else, and it would be better for the new owners to have a pet who had not experienced cruelty, because if you own animals that have been experiencing cruelty in the past, that could be problematic in the sense that the animal will trust human beings less, and that will be worse. It could of course work, but it would be better if the animal did never experience such pain. So you could say it harms the good for that person who's doing the pain, as well as potentially other human beings in society as well. So it's bad for everyone in a sense. Yeah.
Yes. And I would also say that the person will develop bad habits, and habits are acquired through practice, and then they become kind of automated as you practice them a lot. And so this practice of torturing something which is under your control is also a bad trait for interactions between this person and other human beings. So yeah.
Right. So I suppose we could say then that animal abuse should be, I would say, should be prohibited. So it should be illegal, because you could say society or the government has an interest in preserving things that are good for human beings, and they have an interest in sort of making sure that human beings stay on the right path in their moral development. So you could sort of argue for prohibition against animal abuse based on those grounds. What do you think of that?
Yes, I think that's a good argument. I think that sounds like the proper argument for me, because you cannot argue against animal abuse based on strict property rights. So some anarcho-capitalist or very libertarian-minded people would say, well, it's my cat, and so I can do with it what I want because it's my property. But I think your argument is the correct argument, that society, and by the society kind of sets a certain government with the purpose of stopping things which are bad for human beings and for society. And so that's, I think, a very good argument.
Yes, I agree. So that it's a reasonable way could argue for prohibition and of animal abuse, and it's true because it's rational, and we see good arguments for that. So yes, I think this position that we have been defending and articulating, I think it's a very reasonable and true position. Are there more thoughts about this that you want to elaborate on?
Yes, I have one more, I think, important objection that probably if there are any vegans that are listening to this video, they will already be tearing their hair out, because you can ask, is it necessary to eat meat or milk or eggs or all that stuff? And especially, it seems that it's not necessary to eat as much of it as many people are eating today. And so you could then make an argument that since we said that it's a good for human beings themselves to eliminate unnecessary suffering, and it's unnecessary to eat milk and meat in every meal of your day, it is therefore at least a certain percentage of the current animal farming which is happening and which sometimes is connected with violence or with killing animals or with hindering their free movement, seems to be then unnecessary and therefore immoral. What do you think of that?
I suppose I would say that eating meat and eggs and similar things that vegans are against eating, they are all goods for human beings because they provide nourishment for human beings. They are good to eat for the body. They provide different kinds of materials that are good for the body. So they are objectively a good thing for human beings to consume. Even if there are substitutes, even if there are alternatives, there are still good things for human beings to consume. That doesn't mean that you have a duty to eat meat, of course, because again, there can be alternative ways of eating, but it's still a good thing in itself for human beings to eat. So therefore, to slaughter animals in order to provide meat and eggs for human beings to eat, you still have them being killed to provide something that is good for us. But with a sadistic person who is inflicting pain on animals just for fun, for instance, there is nothing good that comes out of it. Yes, he has the experience of fun, perhaps, but that experience of fun is not objectively good for his soul and body at all. So there is an important difference in that, I would say.
Yes, so if if I will repeat your argument so that I understood it correctly, you would say that it is in principle eating things which are edible is something which is good for human beings because it provides nourishment for the body. And so in principle, there is nothing wrong with eating meat or eggs or milk because it provides nourishment for the body. And therefore, also in principle, there is nothing wrong with producing these goods which human beings can then eat.
Right, right. I also would also say that when you kill animals to provide meat and eggs and other things, you should still, of course, I would say, avoid as much unnecessary pain in the process as possible. So it's lawful to kill them, but minimize the pain as much as you can. So that's also something I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I see, like, for example, because I still think if, for example, every person would just only eat half as much animal products, then only half as many animals would have to be killed. So, and also like controlled in their behavior and maybe have their claws cut or have different things done that you have to do if you are a farmer. And so I think probably like a utilitarian vegan would argue that this then would be better because there is less, like if you, and I think this is I'm not sure what I think about this utilitarian approach. There are, it's maybe a discussion for itself, but you could say, well, if people would eat less animal products, then there would be less killing of animals required, for example.
Yes, I can imagine a utilitarian would say that, and I suppose people like Peter Singer would say that because he's an hedonistic utilitarian or a preference, or perhaps a hedonistic utilitarian, if I remember correctly, exactly what he calls himself. So perhaps he would say something like that. But utilitarianism is a false philosophy. So that would not work, I would say. And when it comes to morality, it's based on your quest in obtaining and realizing moral goods and virtues. It's not about having a certain amount of pain and comparing it to a certain amount of pleasure. It's not about that. It's about virtues and realizing and fulfilling your human nature. That is what morality is about, not this sort of quantity question of pain and pleasure, which we have sort of touched upon earlier as well. And I would say that is the utilitarian approach is false, even if the premise is correct that if you cut off half of meat or whatever, you would decrease the total sum of pain would be decreased. Even if that is true, that would necessarily mean we should do it, because that is not the approach we should take to morality.
Yes. Okay, that's an interesting point. I like your brief explanation of it, because I have big problems with utilitarianism, but I couldn't always point it out very well. So that was very good. I think what would therefore be more in line with our argument now is to say that each person should, for himself, eat in a way which is healthy for his own body. And so the problem is not so much about adding or subtracting the number or amount of suffering of animals or people, but it's more this, in the past there used to be one of the big sins was called gluttony. So eating more than your proper appetite or your body requires. And I think there could be found a certain problem, that if people eat more animal products or just any kind of food than is good for them, then that would be bad, because it would start to build a hindrance towards their process towards moral goods.
Yes, that is a good point. Gluttony is bad because it's bad for the body, you could say, and also it sort of disorders the soul. Whether one believes in immortal soul or not, one could at least say that if you practice gluttony, then your appetites sort of take over instead of the reason being sort of the governor of yourself. Because you should always be in self-control. You should have an order between your desires and your reason. There should always be this order in your soul, as Plato would say, as Aristotle would say. And gluttony contradicts that. It creates disorder in the soul. It lets your appetites run wild, you could say, and not be controlled by reason. So yes, that is surely something to think about. And if you are eating and having a lifestyle that involves gluttony and is not according to reason, then you should change that. And I would point out that today there are many who are eating lots of food at the fast food restaurants like McDonald's, and that's not good, not healthy at all to eat those things. So I would encourage people to change and eat more better food, more fruits, more vegetables. That is absolutely something people could eat more of to be more healthy. I believe that's very important. Vitamin D, people have been talking about obtaining that. So there are very many truths with regard to that question. And also I could mention that I've been raised with eating a lot of organic food. And there are people who would argue that organic food is better for you. It's higher quality. And yes, you have arguments for eating organic and avoiding fast food, etc. So absolutely, those are things I would subscribe to, that we eat more healthily. Absolutely.
Yes, I think what perhaps the thing with organic food we could talk about at some point. We can see. I think what I would agree with you, or what I feel similar, is that it's bad not only for your body but also for your moral development if you let your appetites run, basically the appetite control you, instead of you or your I don't know what it exactly is, but the rational faculty or the soul or this thing which is you controlling the bodily appetites. And I think it's a problem when you indulge too much on something that you feel just a mere physical pleasure from. And gluttony can be a kind of addiction. So it's a kind of drug to eat food which tastes well. And you mentioned fast food, and also, of course, sugar is something that has to be mentioned there too. So even though sugar comes from plants, and it's even the animal activists have nothing against eating tons of sugar, but it's actually not good for you, first of all, for your body, but then for this other reason, also for your moral development, to just indulge your desire for sugar without any rational or moral limits.
Right, and also one can distinguish between artificial sugar and natural sugar, because when you talk about natural types of sugar, that's very healthy. But artificial sugar, that's something you have to keep in boundaries and keep and limit. Very true.
Yes, so I think it was good that we discussed this last objection. I don't have anything more to say on this topic of animal rights. So do you have something more?
Well, I think we covered the sort of the philosophical issues that are relevant and made very many good points defending our position. I know that some vegans argue that if you get rid of the industry of killing animals to provide meat, etc., that will be good for the climate, because then you will have less CO2 emissions in the air or atmosphere, and therefore that will be better for the climate. However, that's not really, that is sort of another issue. It's not really about animal rights then, it's about, okay, how should we take care of the climate and the environment? And that can sort of be a separate topic, and people can discuss that as a separate topic. So I would say that when it comes to the principles and philosophies involved, I think we defended the true position very well and showed why the vegan position about animal rights is false. So yeah, I think we can finish here if you want, or yeah, I can let you share your thoughts.
Yes, no, I think you said it well, that we have made, I think, a couple of good arguments and defended our position thereby. And also, I agree that this idea that something is good because it affects some completely unrelated different thing, like in this case, the climate, is not an argument for or against animal rights, of course. So that's good that you brought this out of the way too, because it's true that many people bring this argument up, but it's actually has nothing to do with animal rights.
Right, yes, very true. So I would say that it's okay to eat animals for food, and humans have moral rights. Animals do not fit into this category of having rights, but we should still treat animals well. We should treat our pets well. And I find it very sad that people are having pets and not treating them as well as they could have. So I would actually say that people should treat pets better than many unfortunately are doing today. But still, you can believe this, and you can believe that animal abuse should be prohibited, and still believe that it's okay to eat animals for food, as we have discussed here. So I think we made a good case for our position. And I would therefore say thank you very much, Amos, for having also for being here and having this conversation. And I think I'll therefore wish you and the audience a great Friday, and I will let you share your final thoughts and have the last word.
Yes, I will just say thank you very much for having me on. It was, as always, interesting, and I learned something to formulate my thoughts on this question more precisely. And yes, I'm looking forward to more conversations, and I wish you and the audience also a great weekend.
Great, thank you. Okay, goodbye.
Goodbye.